It was a typical Sunday morning in the quiet suburban neighborhood of Charlotte, North Carolina. The Clark family, like many others in this peaceful part of the city, woke up to a bright sun shining through their window. Thomas Clark, a hard-working real estate agent, was already awake, preparing for another busy day. His wife, Marissa, was still asleep, as usual on weekends. The kids, Emma and Jake, were still in their rooms, enjoying their Saturday sleep-ins. But this particular Sunday morning would change everything. Thomas decided to get an early start on his day, as he often did. He had an important meeting later in the afternoon and wanted to prepare. As he walked down the hallway toward the kitchen, he noticed something odd. The bathroom door was slightly ajar, and it wasn't like Marissa to leave it that way. Curious, Thomas pushed the door open, thinking she might have gotten up early to start her day. But what he saw made his heart stop. Marissa was lying on the bathroom floor in a pool of blood. Her throat had been brutally slit, and her lifeless eyes stared into space. There was a look of surprise frozen on her face. It was as if she had been caught off guard, the terror in her eyes telling a story of an unimaginable final moment. Thomas stumbled back, his mind racing. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. Marissa, the woman he had been married to for 15 years, was dead. His mind went blank. He fumbled for his phone, dialing 911 with shaking hands. 911? What's your emergency? My wife. She's dead. I found her in the bathroom. Someone killed her. Thomas's voice cracked as he spoke. He was still in shock, barely able to process what had just happened. The operator calmly asked him to stay on the line while dispatching the police. Within minutes, sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder as they approached the Clark residence. Thomas was still standing by the bathroom, his mind numb. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the horrific scene in front of him. As the officers arrived and began to process the scene, the first question on everyone's mind was, who would do such a thing? The Clark family had been well liked in the neighborhood, their lives seemingly perfect. There were no signs of forced entry into the home, and nothing appeared to be stolen. It was a brutal, personal attack. As detectives began questioning Thomas, they quickly learned that he had been out of the house for most of the day on Saturday, meeting clients. Marissa had been home with the kids. The family was well known for keeping to themselves, and there were no signs of any kind of trouble at home. Everything seemed normal on the surface, but beneath that surface, something was terribly wrong. Marissa and Thomas Clark had always been seen as the perfect couple. From the outside, they seemed to have it all: a beautiful home, 2 wonderful children, and successful careers. Thomas was a real estate agent, and Marissa, a stay-at-home mom, spent her days raising their kids, Emma and Jake. Their life seemed picture-perfect, the kind of life others envied. But appearances can be deceiving. The truth was that their marriage had been struggling for years. Behind the facade of a happy family, Thomas and Marissa's relationship had grown cold. The spark that had once ignited their love was slowly fading, replaced by routine and distant conversations. Thomas's demanding job kept him away from home, and Marissa, once a passionate and lively woman, found herself feeling lonely and neglected. She had tried to talk to Thomas about it, but he was always too busy to listen. The frustration built up, and she began to feel like she was living a lie. She loved her children, of course, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being trapped in a loveless marriage. She longed for something more. It wasn't that she wanted to leave Thomas. She still cared about him, but she wanted to feel alive again, to feel wanted. She needed something outside of her role as a wife and mother. This is where Ryan Hayes came into the picture. Ryan was a plumber, rugged and handsome, with a mysterious air about him. He had worked on the Clark family's home a few times over the years, fixing various things around the house. Marissa had always been polite to him, exchanging pleasantries as he worked. But one day, something changed. It started with a small problem. The kitchen faucet was leaking. Thomas, as usual, brushed it off, too busy with work to handle it. Frustrated, Marissa called Ryan to come fix it. She didn't expect much, just a simple repair. But when he arrived, something shifted. Their casual conversation lingered longer than usual. Ryan was charming, attentive, and easy to talk to. For the first time in a long while, Marissa felt seen. Their connection was instant. There was no denying the chemistry between them. Ryan was different from Thomas. He had a raw, unpolished quality that drew Marissa in. She felt an attraction she hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't just physical. Ryan listened to her in a way that Thomas never did. He made her feel important, special, and alive again. Over the following months, their interactions grew more frequent. Marissa found excuses for him to come back to the house. It was always something small, a broken sink, a leaky pipe. But every time he came, the connection between them grew stronger. What began as a friendship soon turned into flirtation, and before long, it became an affair. Marissa knew it was wrong. She was married, and her actions would devastate her family if they ever found out. But the rush of excitement, the thrill of being wanted, made it hard to stop. For the first time in years, she felt alive. She couldn't let go of the feeling, even though she knew the consequences could be dire. But as the affair continued, so did the guilt. Marissa was torn between the life she had built with Thomas and the passion she found with Ryan. She couldn't escape the constant tug of war inside her. She was living a lie, and it was eating her up inside. Little did she know, her secret life would soon spiral out of control. As the weeks passed, Marissa's secret life with Ryan became harder to hide. The tension between her duties as a wife and her affair weighed heavily on her. She had always been a good mother, caring and attentive to Emma and Jake, but her mind was no longer fully present. It was as if her soul had divided, one part tied to the family she had built, and the other to the passionate but dangerous world she had created with Ryan. One evening, after putting the children to bed, Marissa sat in the living room, staring blankly at the TV. The silence in the house felt suffocating. She reached for her phone, scrolling through her messages, her heart racing as she saw Ryan's name appear on the screen. He had texted her earlier that day, asking if she wanted to meet later that evening. She hesitated. It was getting harder to keep up with the lies. Just as she was about to reply, the sound of the front door creaking open broke her thoughts. Thomas had come home earlier than expected. Marissa quickly locked her phone, shoving it into the cushion beside her. Thomas walked into the living room, his briefcase in hand, a look of frustration on his face. "Another long day at work?" Marissa asked, her voice betraying none of the guilt that was bubbling up inside her. "Yeah," Thomas replied, setting his briefcase down on the coffee table. "It's been crazy. Clients calling me all day. I barely had time to eat lunch." He sat down beside her, his body language exhausted. "I feel like I haven't had a moment to breathe lately. It's all just so much." Marissa nodded sympathetically, though part of her wanted to scream, to tell him how she felt, how lonely she had been, but she didn't say anything. She never did. Instead, she smiled and reached out to touch his hand. "I'm sorry you're feeling like that," she said softly, squeezing his hand. "Maybe we could take a weekend away soon? Just the two of us?" Thomas looked at her, his tired eyes meeting hers. For a moment, there was a flicker of hope in his expression. Maybe she was finally reaching out. Maybe they could reconnect. "That sounds good. Maybe we could go to that cabin we talked about last year," he suggested. "We could use some time alone, just to relax." Marissa's stomach turned. She had no intention of going away with him. She had already made plans with Ryan, and the thought of canceling made her feel nauseous. But she smiled and agreed, her mind already racing with excuses for how she could juggle both. Later that night, after Thomas had gone to bed, Marissa sat in the dark, her phone clutched tightly in her hands. She sent a message to Ryan. "Can't tonight? Something came up. Let's plan for tomorrow." She didn't want to cancel on him, but she had to. Her family was falling apart, and she was caught in the middle of it. The lies were piling up, and she didn't know how much longer she could keep pretending everything was fine. Little did she know, Thomas had begun to suspect something. He had noticed the way she acted lately, how distant she had become. He hadn't been blind to the small changes in her behavior, the late nights, the distracted conversations. He couldn't put his finger on it, but he felt it. Something was wrong. The next day, Thomas decided to follow her. He knew it was wrong, but his gut told him something was off. He waited until she left the house, then slipped into his car and followed her. He kept a safe distance, careful not to alert her that he was watching. He trailed her through the streets, his heart pounding in his chest. Where was she going? His mind raced as he drove, his suspicions growing stronger with every turn she made. Finally, she parked outside a small cafe on the outskirts of town. Thomas pulled into a nearby parking lot, watching from a distance. Marissa got out of the car and walked into the cafe. Thomas didn't follow her right away. Instead, he sat there, stewing in his thoughts. Could it be? Was she meeting someone? Minutes later, he saw a man walk into the cafe. Ryan. Thomas didn't recognize him at first, but when the man and Marissa embraced, his heart dropped. He couldn't deny what he was seeing. His wife was having an affair. The anger inside him surged, but he couldn't move. He didn't know what to do. How could she betray him like this? How long had this been going on? Thomas sat in his car, staring at the cafe window, watching his wife and the man who had taken her from him. He had no idea what to do next, but he knew one thing. His life and his family would never be the same again. The next few days were a blur for Thomas. The anger and betrayal that burned inside him were overwhelming, but he kept his emotions in check. He didn't confront Marissa right away. Instead, he watched her, carefully observing her every move. He knew she was hiding something, but now he had proof. The image of her with Ryan, the way they looked at each other, it was all he needed to confirm his worst fears. Thomas continued to go through the motions of daily life, pretending nothing had changed. He smiled at the kids, made dinner, helped with homework, but inside, his mind was racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that his entire world was crumbling around him. The woman he loved, the mother of his children, had betrayed him in the worst possible way. Then, one night, after the kids were asleep, Thomas couldn't take it anymore. He needed answers. "Marissa," he said quietly, as they sat together in the living room, his voice calm but cold. "We need to talk." She looked up from her phone, startled. "About what?" Thomas leaned forward, his eyes locking with hers. "About Ryan. About everything." Her heart skipped a beat. For a moment, she didn't know what to say. The truth had come out, and there was no escaping it now. "Thomas, I'm so sorry," she began, her voice trembling. "It was a mistake. I never meant for this to happen." "Don't," Thomas interrupted, his voice sharp. "Don't tell me it was a mistake. You've been lying to me for months. You've been seeing him behind my back." Tears welled up in Marissa's eyes. She didn't want to hurt him, but she had. "I never wanted to hurt you, Thomas. But you haven't been there for me. I felt so alone. Ryan, he listened to me. He made me feel like I mattered." Thomas's anger flared. "And what about our family? What about our children? How do you think they'll feel when they find out?" Marissa's face crumpled. "I never wanted to destroy our family. I didn't know how to fix things. I didn't know what else to do." The silence between them was thick with regret and anger. Thomas's heart was breaking. He wanted to scream, to throw something, but instead, he sat there, numb. He had no idea what came next. He had no idea if their marriage could survive this. All he knew was that everything was different now. The next few days were filled with arguments, tears, and uncomfortable silences. Marissa didn't know if she could undo the damage she had caused. She knew she had made a terrible mistake, but the connection she had with Ryan still lingered in her mind. She didn't know where her heart truly lay, her family, or the passion she had found in another man. And as Thomas tried to figure out what to do next, he realized one thing. He couldn't stay in a marriage built on lies. The trust had been broken, and no matter how much he wanted to fix things, the damage was done. The days following the confrontation between Thomas and Marissa were filled with emotional turmoil. Thomas had never felt so distant from her, even though she was sitting right next to him. The gap between them was like an impenetrable wall, built on lies, betrayal, and shattered trust. Thomas didn't know how to fix things. He didn't know if they could be fixed. For Marissa, the weight of her actions sat heavy on her chest. She felt the sting of guilt Every time she looked at Thomas, every time she interacted with Emma and Jake, she had betrayed them all. She had chosen her own desires over the family she once cherished. The pain was unbearable, but there was also a part of her that didn't know if she could walk away from Ryan. The connection with him had been so intense, so real, it felt impossible to just cut it off. But the reality of her situation was clear. She had made a choice, and now she had to live with the consequences. As the days passed, the conversations between Thomas and Marissa grew shorter. They spoke about the kids, the house, and the small, trivial things, but the raw honesty and love that had once defined their relationship seemed to be slipping away with every word. One evening, Thomas returned home from work earlier than usual. The house was eerily quiet, and when he walked into the living room, he found Marissa sitting on the couch, staring at her phone with a look of uncertainty. She hadn't been texting Ryan, but there was something in her eyes, something that made Thomas's heart sink. She looked up at him, her face pale and drawn. "Thomas, I think we need to talk." He didn't respond at first. He just stood there, his eyes searching hers, trying to gauge whether there was any chance of reconciliation. He was angry, hurt, and confused, but deep down, he still loved her. That love, however, was slowly being buried beneath the weight of her betrayal. "About what?" he finally asked, his voice low. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice shaky. "And I don't know if we can fix this. I don't know if I can go back to the way things were. But I also don't want to lose everything we've built. I don't want to lose you or the kids." The words stung, but Thomas didn't let them show. He crossed the room slowly, sitting down on the edge of the couch, his eyes never leaving hers. "Marissa, what are you saying?" he asked softly, though his heart was pounding in his chest. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. I think it's time for us to make a decision. We need to figure out if we can move forward or if we're just holding on to something that's already broken." Thomas clenched his jaw, his fists tightening at his sides. He had known this conversation was coming, but hearing her say the words out loud felt like a dagger to the heart. "I can't keep living in this limbo," he continued, his voice cracking. "I don't know how to forgive you, Marissa. Not right now. I don't even know if I can." Marissa's face crumpled, and tears welled up in her eyes. She reached out, her hand trembling as she touched his arm. "I know I've ruined everything. I don't want to lose you. I love you, Thomas. I do. But I've made so many mistakes, and I don't know if you can ever forgive me." Thomas closed his eyes, his emotions threatening to overwhelm him. He had spent so many years building this life with Marissa. The thought of losing it all felt unbearable, but the trust between them had been shattered beyond repair. He couldn't pretend everything was okay anymore. "I don't know if I can forgive you," he said, his voice quiet. "I don't know if I can trust you again. And that scares me, because I don't want to lose my family, but I can't keep living like this." Marissa nodded, her tears falling freely now. She had no answers, no solutions. She only knew that the road ahead would be difficult, and no matter the choice they made, things would never be the same. The silence between them grew heavy. It was as if both of them were waiting for something, an answer, a sign, a miracle, that would give them the courage to move forward, but neither of them knew what that was. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Thomas stood up from the couch. "I think we need some time apart," he said quietly, his words hanging in the air like a weight. "I need to figure out what I want. What we want." Marissa nodded, her heart breaking even further. She knew this was the beginning of the end, but part of her wondered if it was the right decision. Could they rebuild their relationship? Could they ever find their way back to each other? "I understand," she whispered. "I just want you to know that I love you. And I'll always love you." Thomas didn't respond right away. He walked toward the door, his footsteps heavy. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing. Everything was different now. The following weeks were some of the hardest for both Thomas and Marissa. They lived under the same roof, but in separate worlds. They barely spoke to each other, except when it was necessary for the kids. Their marriage, once filled with love and laughter, now felt like a distant memory. The distance between them had grown so wide that even their attempts at small talk seemed forced. For Marissa, the pain of losing Thomas was unbearable. She had made her mistakes, and now she was paying the price. Ryan's presence in her life had made everything more complicated, but she knew that part of her was still tied to the family she had built with Thomas. She had never imagined her life would turn out this way. She missed him, the man she had fallen in love with all those years ago. On the other hand, Thomas was struggling to reconcile the man he was now with the man he used to be. The anger and hurt still burned inside him, but he also knew he needed to make a choice. Was it possible to rebuild the trust between them? Could they truly start over after everything that had happened? One afternoon, as Thomas sat in the living room, looking out the window at the fading light of the day, Marissa approached him. She stood at the edge of the room, hesitating for a moment before speaking. "Thomas, can we talk?" she asked quietly. He turned to face her, his eyes wary. "What about?" "I don't know what comes next," she began, her voice trembling. "I don't know if we can ever go back to what we were, but I know I don't want to give up on us. I want to try again, if you're willing to." Thomas looked at her, his emotions conflicted. He had never stopped loving her, but he wasn't sure if he could trust her again. He wasn't sure if he could forgive her. "I don't know if I can," he replied softly, "but I'm willing to try, if you are." Marissa's eyes filled with hope. It wasn't the answer she had been hoping for, but it was something. It was a chance. The road ahead would be difficult. They both knew it, but for the first time in weeks, they felt like they were on the same page again. The weeks that followed were a delicate balance of hope and heartache. Thomas and Marissa made efforts to communicate, to rebuild what had been shattered. Their conversations were slow, careful, and laced with hesitation, but there were small moments of tenderness too. They began to talk about their memories, the laughter they shared, the dreams they once had together. It wasn't easy, but both of them were trying, however falteringly. But there was an underlying tension, an unresolved question hanging in the air between them. Could they truly forgive each other? Could they forget the painful past and build something new? Thomas knew that to move forward, he would have to find a way to trust Marissa again. He couldn't keep living in the shadow of her betrayal, but the thought of losing his family, of losing everything he had fought for, made him reluctant to make any rash decisions. Every time he thought about the possibility of moving on, he felt a pang in his chest. He wasn't ready to give up on his family, not yet. Marissa, on the other hand, felt the heavy weight of guilt every day. She wanted to make amends, to show Thomas that she was still worthy of his love. But no matter how hard she tried, she could never erase the guilt of her affair. She wasn't sure if she could ever repair the damage she had caused, and that uncertainty gnawed at her constantly. Then one night, after a tense dinner with the kids, Thomas and Marissa found themselves sitting in the living room, the silence between them louder than any words they could have said. They hadn't spoken for hours, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Marissa was the first to break the silence. "Thomas, I think we need to talk about what happens next," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I can't keep living like this. We've been trying to move forward, but I don't know if we're getting anywhere, and I don't want to waste any more time pretending that everything is fine." Thomas turned to her, his heart heavy. He could feel the weight of her words in his chest. He knew she was right. They couldn't keep dancing around the elephant in the room. They had to make a decision, once and for all. "Do you think we can fix this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think we can go back to the way things were?" Marissa's eyes filled with uncertainty. "I don't know. I don't know if we can ever go back to what we had, but I do know that I love you, and I want to try." Thomas sat back, running a hand through his hair. His mind raced, torn between his love for her and the scar she had left on his heart. The past few weeks had been full of fleeting hope, but they had also been marked by painful reminders of what they had lost. He didn't know if he could take the risk again. He didn't know if he was strong enough to forgive her fully. Suddenly, the doorbell rang, cutting through the tension in the room like a jarring note in a melody. Thomas and Marissa exchanged a glance, confused by the interruption. Neither of them was expecting company. Thomas stood and walked to the door, wondering who could be at the house so late. When he opened it, his eyes widened in shock. Standing there, drenched in rain, was Ryan, Marissa's affair. His face was tense, his eyes filled with something Thomas couldn't quite place. "Ryan," Thomas said, his voice steady but tinged with a coldness he didn't intend. "Thomas, I need to talk to Marissa," Ryan said, his voice low but urgent. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his eyes never leaving Thomas's. "It's important." Thomas was taken aback. He hadn't seen Ryan since that fateful night, and the presence of the man who had caused so much turmoil in his life filled him with an overwhelming sense of anger. He felt his pulse quicken. "What the hell are you doing here?" Thomas demanded, his fists clenched at his sides. Ryan didn't flinch. "I didn't come here to fight. I came here to tell her the truth. The whole truth." Marissa, who had been watching from the living room, now stood frozen in place. Her heart raced, and she exchanged a quick, panicked glance with Thomas. "Ryan, please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You shouldn't be here. This isn't the right time." But Ryan wasn't backing down. "It's time, Marissa. It's time you knew everything." Thomas felt his heart stop. What could Ryan possibly have to say that would make things any worse than they already were? Was there more to the story? More lies Marissa had kept hidden from him? Marissa's face paled as she took a step toward Ryan, her breath catching in her throat. She looked at Thomas, her eyes pleading for understanding. "Thomas, please," she said, her voice barely audible. "I didn't want this to happen, but there are things you don't know." The words hung in the air like a ticking time bomb. Thomas felt the anger inside him surge again, but there was also a sense of dread. What was coming next? Could they ever truly recover from everything that had happened? Ryan's gaze shifted between the two of them, his expression unreadable. And then, just as Thomas was about to demand answers, Ryan said something that would change everything. "The baby isn't mine, Marissa," Ryan said, his words like a shockwave crashing through the room. "It's Thomas's. I never told you, but I found out 2 months ago. I didn't want to be the one to come between you and your family. But you need to know the truth before it destroys you." The suspense builds as the truth comes to light, leaving both Thomas and Marissa stunned by the revelation. The future of their relationship now stands at an uncertain crossroads. Could this unexpected twist offer them a second chance, or will it be the final blow?